Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the UCL's Lunch Hour Lectures. I'm Paola Lettieri, I'm a professor of chemical engineering and here in my role as academic director for UCL EAST, our new campus at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. This is the third lecture of this series, which is dedicated to the programs and new activities that we'll be launching at UCL EAST. In the first two lectures, we have given you a taster of some of the research activities that are being planned for UCL EAST. So we touched on the Internet of Things and Internet of Wild Things. And then on Tuesday, we had a rather fun lecture on playing the archive. So how research in that case can link the past to the present and then look into the future. But today's the focus is on educational programs and the facilities that we have designed for UCL EAST, so to enable the connection between research and teaching and also between theory and practice, so following the principles of the connected curriculum. Before I formally introduce John, who will be delivering the lecture today, perhaps I need to say a couple of words about UCL EAST, and in particular spelling out the acronym, which stands for Experiments, Arts, Society and Technology. So the lecture today wants to explain how the teaching programs and the learning and teaching facilities at UCL EAST have been thought of and developed really with in mind that philosophy. So bringing together different faculties and therefore different disciplines from across UCL in sharing spaces and so enable the new element of collaboration and the creation of new ideas for tackling the global challenges that the research activities want to address. So Professor John Mitchell has been at the heart of the discussions and really idea creation around the learning programs and the teaching and learning facilities at UCL EAST. John is Professor of Communication Systems Engineering in the Faculty of Engineering Sciences, but is also Vice Dean Education in Engineering. And with UCL EAST, he wears a couple of hats, I would say. One as faculty lead for the Faculty of Engineering, so looking after the entire section of activities that engineering will be having on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. But then program-wide, really working with us on the design of the new learning spaces. You're also the co-director of the Center for Engineering Education and also the former director of the award-winning Integrated Engineering Program, which has perhaps inspired some of the thinking behind the lecture today. John, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola. And thank you for that warm introduction. So today I just wanted to say a little bit about some of the thinking behind the education programs and some of the planning that has gone through. With the team in academic planning within the UCL EAST office, we're looking at something that's actually rather different for UCL in the way that we have an opportunity here to design the programs. And so through some examples, I'm not going to go line by line of all the programs that are available, but to touch on some examples of how the opportunity of UCL EAST is allowing us to do something a little bit different. So just as a bit of background for those that may not know so much about it, UCL EAST is a very large campus at the southern end of the Olympic site. So the size of buildings allowable through the full 4 phases of development are around 40% of the current Bloomsbury campus. In phase 1, the proposal is 50,000 square metres of academic and residential student accommodation activities across 2 buildings. So this is Paul Street West and the Marshgate building, with others in the master plan to follow on in successive phases. In phase 1, up to 4,000 students and over 250 staff are planned to be on the park for the majority of their education. as well as students attending particular activities from Bloomsbury and potentially the other way around. And I'll mention this a little bit later, but this is part of a much larger activity on the park called the East Bank, which sort of falls along this line here that runs along the riverside on the Olympic Park. So it's a major investment and a major new opportunity for activities. And from the very early days, a vision of what such a campus and being able to design things from the ground up would allow has been put in place. And so particularly there was an emphasis on trying to look at using this as an opportunity to think slightly differently about what we do. And particularly because of our sort of four main activities of a university: research, education, enterprise and public engagement. We really wanted to make sure as a team involved in UCL EAST that all those four activities were considered, but considered in a holistic view. Now, I guess I have to caveat what I'm going to say a little bit. I'm not for a moment suggesting that these things don't go well in Bloomsbury and that we haven't been incredibly successful in any of them. But what I do want to highlight is the opportunity of a new building in a new part of London in a slightly different way that allows us to do things that we just haven't historically been able to do in the way departments or activities have grown up quite naturally on the Bloomsbury campus or other campuses around. There are some very good examples of satellite activities that have had this in small part, but that combined with the scale of UCL EAST, I want to try and suggest gives us a really unique opportunity to think differently about how we can connect these areas together as we develop new programs, new activities, and think about what the next generation of education, research, enterprise and public engagement is going to look like. So as Paola mentioned, I spent 4 years, a few years back, working on a program to redesign the curriculum and the activities of the engineering faculty. The integrated engineering program looked at the 8 departments that taught our main core undergraduate programs and looked at how we could teach them differently, how we could bring in more projects, more problem-based learning, greater emphasis on the developing of skills alongside developing theory, and how we could connect those departments together. We've won an award, so there must be some success in there. I hope the students are feeling the success of it. And we had a conference recently and some of our alumni came back and talked about particularly how the emphasis on skills has helped them, and now they've gone out into the world of work in a range of jobs. But one thing that really struck me from the time doing that was we spend a lot of time in this particular part here, looking at particularly the curriculum. We spend an awful lot of time talking about curriculum. We probably spend a little less time, and probably less than is really deserved, talking about the pedagogy, how we actually deliver that curriculum, what are the activities that students are going to do to gain that learning. And the one thing that really struck me over the 5 years of doing this was, in terms of education, we spend much less time individually. I know at higher level this is often talked about, the student experience, but thinking about what makes that student experience. What is it about the culture of the department? How it connects the various things that go on in the department to what the education is? Or is it just a standalone program that doesn't really connect with the other parts of the department? How is research and teaching and enterprise actually connected? We spend much less time thinking about that. And at UCL we spend an awful lot of time moaning about it, but probably less time doing anything about the environment. What is it about the spaces that we use, the types of facilities that we give the students, that actually really drive the pedagogy and the curriculum? And I would argue that maybe this is a place to start the discussion, but without really getting the discussion into these other two areas, life of changing a curriculum and particularly changing a pedagogy is really very difficult. And so what I'd like to suggest here is that UCL EAST gives us a real opportunity to think about a culture that's not based around departments necessarily, a culture that actually from the very fundamental starting point allows us to think about how all the activities could interact in some sense, if meaningful. I don't think anyone's suggesting that we're going to force collaborations. But when we talk about the sorts of things that are going on, actually all the partners have already started thinking about what it is about what their degrees want to do that will match with others that are also being developed in parallel. And again, this is part of the opportunity. Rarely do we develop 50 programs in parallel at more or less the same time, where usually we try and link with things that are existing, or we're trying to marry things together after the fact. But actually the ability to develop things in parallel and see those connections from an early stage gives an opportunity that we haven't usually had. As well as the environment. As I say, in the past we've thought about what we'd like to do here and then tried to fit it to the environment we have at best, or been constrained by what we have here that is forcing pedagogies that are not quite what we would like to have done. The idea we have, I look at Paola very cautiously when I say it's almost a blank sheet of paper of what we can design in a building. I'm contractually obliged to say within financial constraints, I think, at that point. But we have the opportunity to develop something that really fits to what we want to do and design things for purpose is, I think, such an exciting opportunity. For many of us, it's been absolutely overwhelming and we've not really known quite what to do with it at times. So I'm going to try and pick some of those out in a little more detail and give you some examples from the portfolio of UCL EAST to illustrate some of the ideas. So first I want to talk about the culture. So what is very different, and some days a real headache, but some days a real pleasure, is the idea that across two buildings, separated by a bridge and a river, we have 8 different faculties. We have a list of 15, I think, different activities that are going on. Now, most universities build a building for a department, or at most a faculty. The idea of a multi-use building with multiple different connected around a vision activities, but that don't necessarily fall in disciplinary boxes, is very different. Very exciting, but also very challenging. So the idea that people from the life sciences are working alongside people from robotics, from a business school alongside culture and an interest in the oral history of London, gives opportunities for collaboration that probably we hadn't even seen when the discussions first started. And so this culture is feeling really at the heart of how the programs are starting to grow up and develop over time. So if we think about some of the research that's going on, we try and really to link to that vision of experiment, art, society and technology. So our research activities based around creative practice, creative media, new ways of presenting information to the outside world, around robotics, around design for disability, around how we get information from the environment, from sensors, and what that means for the environment itself, how we design sustainably, ecologically, our cities, our infrastructure, and all our activities. And as well as how we think about our history, our public history, our oral history. We also have activities around making, around the development and interaction with materials, around manufacturing, and around what the next generation of transport and fuel is going to look like. So our research themes may seem very varied, and sometimes when we write out a list, it's not always obvious what the connections are. But actually, when we sit in a room and start thinking about how our activities actually tie together, we start to see many, many synergies between the research activities that are going to play out on the park. As well as being very clear from the beginning that this is a research-led activity. It's driven by these research activities, and these are at the core of what we do. But that is alongside our education. And so our research here is very visible. And again, this is something that we see in the newer buildings of UCL, but particularly in the older buildings, often our research labs are locked away behind safety doors with formidable do not enter signs where students don't really feel they have a presence. The facilities allow us to think about how this research is not only accessible but visible to all who come through the building and see what is there. And again, this I think is a different aspect of how the education and research is going to play out. The research is not for those, particularly for undergraduate students, is not something that's hidden away. It's front and centre, core, accessible and visible within the building to encourage that sort of interaction. Which brings me a little bit to the environment, to think about how we design the spaces that we're going to interact with. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about the teaching space. And this is something of a contested area. What is the modern activity going to look like? Well, I stand in front of you in a lecture theatre that probably Socrates would recognise. We are in the amphitheatre style of the sage on the stage in front of you, he says confidently, and rows of seats of the aghast and fascinated audience soaking up every word. Now, some would argue this is a model of education that has lasted 2,000–3,000 years. It's not necessarily a bad model. It's held its own against many others. But equally, there's much more to the education than this sort of delivery. So we do have one or two lecture theatres. I know there was I think from a PR position at the early days, should we say we have no lecture theatres? This is going to be entirely different. And people will say, yeah, it sends a message, that's quite interesting. Oh, but they can be useful. So I think, and this is probably within UCL style quite considerably, rather than make a big statement for no particular good effect, there are a couple of lecture theatres. There's a cinema that Michael is involved in that can double as a lecture theatre. There is, I think, one or two rate lecture theatres of some style within. But the majority of the spaces are much more collaborative environments. They're designed to be from small seminar rooms to collaborative tutorial rooms. So this is based loosely somewhere between a teal room and actually something that Harvard Business School were quite prominent in developing of what they call a hive, a room where actually students can present to themselves, you can roll whiteboards in between them, but you can also sort of present to all the students and they can interact. And so different types of environments that allow different types of teaching to go on and different types of activity within those rooms. We've also looked very much at the specialist activities. And again, the culture pervades into the environment. Now, whenever you start thinking about these particularly very expensive high-end teaching labs, you end up with a slightly awkward dichotomy. Ideally, you'd like them to be quite big so you can get big classes through, you can do lots of different types of activities, you can segregate them into different activities and do multiple things in them. But actually, any one department will find it very difficult to utilise that sort of space continually. And so we're looking, or been looking into and using a very different model of shared resources across a number of departments and faculties into specialist teaching labs. Now, this is a model a number of universities have started to move towards. And again, UCL EAST gives us an opportunity here where we design labs now around function rather than necessarily around a one set of people that are going to use it. And so we can actually have staff that can support different types of activities. So in here you can have anything from sort of physical, mechanical, electrical types activities. Here anything that requires sort of sinks and chemicals and different things. Anything where students are going to group work together, do projects together. And we're creating different types of spaces that will support the programs in different ways. Not spaces that belong particularly to any one discipline or department. Now, Again, with all of that, it's a slightly different way of thinking. It's not how we've usually designed some of these sorts of activities when a department has had a building, which brings up both opportunities and challenges for the programs that are going to go into them. Also, we have the Institute of Making, we have Culture Lab, so a space for allowing students from multiple programs to interact with artifacts. Again, something that really appeals to a wide number of programs. UCL has pioneered a lot of object-based learning and the ability of students to interact with objects of different types, with different types of requirements, but in a space that is designed and able to support that. As well as the Future Media Studio, which has a range of facilities, both for the talk courses within that, but also supporting other courses in delivering different types of material. As well as all the student services that are going to need to support that. And again, it's been an interesting process where actually I think we've seen UCL grow these services over many years. Now they finally have a home in the Student Centre and drawing a lot on the experience of the Student Centre to find how we need the sorts of services we're going to need to provide to a cohort of students that are on the park. Because I think it's very important to say about those students is we really must tread the tightrope between making those students feel that they belong at the Stratford campus, that this is their home and there is a reason for being there. This isn't some satellite of Bloomsbury, this is their home, this is where they belong, but also that they are part of the much bigger UCL. And that balance, I think, is going to take us some time to really get quite right, but it's absolutely vital to make this project work, that our students feel that they're there for a reason. And part of it is going to be these facilities, that there's a reason for being here. They're getting an experience of their learning that Bloomsbury just couldn't provide for a whole host of reasons that I hope I've touched on a little bit. So the last part is where we usually start, about the pedagogy and the curriculum. So thinking about how the student interacts is not new. This Confucius phrase is rolled out at the beginning of many a good educational lecture. But what does it mean to involve the student? So another aspect that's often used is Kolb's cycle. If there's any educationalists in the audience before you start throwing things at me about Kolb, I know it's heavily disputed from the psychology. But as a tool to think about what sort of activities you have in your curriculum design, it's actually, I find it quite useful to think about actually we need to build some of these opportunities in the way we deliver material to students, the activities we give our students, to allow them to take the abstract theory, the generalisation, and reflect on it through applying it and through learning from that sort of experience. And that's very much what our experiential learning idea is trying to draw out. Now, experiential learning typically is viewed in one of two terms. Either something within the curriculum that helps the student apply their theoretical knowledge, some form of experience. Now, again, these are theories that have been talked about for a long time. You can go back to the 20s and 30s, and Dewey and Kirkpatrick talked about project-based learning and the project being a vehicle for student learning. But thinking about what activities connected to our research, connected to our facilities, our students can interact with. As well, or the more direct view of actually students going out and really experiencing things as part of their education. We tend to break experiential learning down into these two parts. And we have to be a little bit careful. We pushed experiential learning a great deal within the IEP when we designed it, and did some research on how the students felt about it. We talked a lot about authentic learning, the fact that the sort of problems that the students should deal with, the projects they should be involved in, should be authentic, should feel real, should not be toy projects, but something that has a meaning and they can connect to. And to an extent that works well, except what we found was actually what the students believe to be authentic is not actually necessarily what is truly authentic. And many things that we actually took from industry as real direct examples of authentic ways projects would evolve, the students didn't feel were real. And they got very upset by that and shied away from it because they thought we were sort of teasing them, despite actually they were real examples that came from industry. So again, there's a fine line about what authenticity means to the students, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it is absolutely authentic. And that needs to play out a little bit in how we design the activities. So if we take that, again, I'm using the word pedagogy perhaps loosely as a framing for the sorts of activities we might use, we come to curriculum. And at UCL, we talk heavily about the connected curriculum. We talk about the six aspects of the connected curriculum that we want to see in our programs. And all I've talked about so far plays very well to those 6 aspects, and these are examples of how that might play out. So I've just talked through the 6 and give some examples of what that's meaning for some of the programs that we're talking about. So one of our early adopter programs that's currently starting at here East, at the north end of the park, is from the Global Disability Innovation Hub. So a centre out of engineering but collaborating with many others that looks at how we design the world or artefacts for those with various sorts of disabilities and how we collect data sets about what's going on. So this is a project in India that is central to some of the data set that's used within the MSc Disciplinary Design and Innovation that will be starting later this year, that actually uses wheelchair users and sensors that they have on their wheelchairs to actually map the accessibility of cities. So they're collecting data all the time about how difficult it is to access and how the access affects their mobility around the city. So this is real-life research, funded research, part of a major international project that is feeding directly into the design of the MSc as one of the case studies and data sets that they use within the MSc. So this is bringing the researchers to the students, to bringing the research that we're doing into the heart of the program. The second aspect is this through line of research. And again, here I'd like to draw out the environment that we provide. So some of the aspects that I've talked about, the memory workshop, the object-based learning room, these are, at their heart, research facilities. They are allowing researchers to interact with objects, store objects, to collect new data sets in the case of the memory workshop. But they're also places for the students. And again, this is something that we have good examples at UCL. I think we could do with more of spaces where the line between it being an educational space and it being a research space is very much blurred. And often we only do that because we have to and we only have one space. These are designed to be spaces like that, where the research and the students' interaction with that research is a fundamental part of the programs that they're involved in. The third aspect is about students making connections across subjects and out to the world. And so here, I think it's important to mention some of the partners that are going to be on the park. And again, this broader culture and broader environment that we're in is bringing increased opportunities. So if we look, so Marshgate and Paul Street buildings are here, and the Olympic Stadium, West Ham, and the Aquatic Centre here, Westfield Shopping Centre. This is the East Bank site. Waterfront, site. The whole thing's East Bank, is it? Good. Where we have the Victoria and Albert Museum, we have Sadler's Wells, we have London College of Fashion, we have the BBC Symphony Orchestra and Chorus. So we have a number of partners, all of whom are very keen to interact. Accommodation, I think, is the red on here. And build new relationships. Now, this can be many things. It's interesting, of course. You know, we started with London College of Fashion, and immediately, well, everyone thought, oh, well, I'm sure there's cultural interactions and things we can do. Actually, they were very interested to talk to us in engineering about wearable technologies, and so a whole range of new conversations are building up about how we interact with this new set of partners on what really will, I hope, feel a very vibrant university and cultural district as part of the park. And again, the ability of, so I think roughly within a few years everything opens at the same time. The ability to design from the ground up new programs, new approaches. Obviously London College of Fashion, I think, are moving a lot of their existing activity out there rather than necessarily new activity. But these new relationships, I think, are going to be a fundamental part of how our students interact beyond the walls of their degree. The fourth one is probably the most close to the experiential learning in direct comparison, connect with workplace learning. And so here, a new program being developed in engineering around product design and innovative design. And so here, didn't even know it did that. We're looking really to build links with the industries that are in East London. Across from manufacturing through to high value, small, bespoke, creative design firms. There's a wealth of activity in East London. Much of it is relatively small industry. Not so much of the big industry is there as it used to be. But the ability of students working in a design, in a product innovation space to interact. And so we're looking at a slightly different model. It's actually borrowing, probably more common in North America, Canada, a co-op model of interactive terms, where large projects where students might spend time between the industrial partner and the program delivering on a particular product or process or project over the course. So something that really tries to tie the interaction with industry much more firmly into the curriculum. So rather than it being a year out or a summer placement, here actually the learning that we expect the students to have for credit as part of their degree is a mix between the activity and the workplace, between the university and the workplace. The fifth area about outputs and assessments directed at an audience. I think, again, this comes in many different flavours across the degrees, but by far the most obvious is the suite of programmes across the Future Media Studio. So whether it's documentary making, ethnographic film, or moving through to new media of how virtual reality, augmented reality, how new digital content types are designed, developed, and how that new material interacts with the audience is a central part of a number of degree programs that are going to be moving onto the park. And the sixth one is about students connecting with each other, and particularly across phases and across programs. So an example, we heard about the Internet of Wild Things earlier, or may have heard about it in one of the earlier talks. This, I think, is a very good example of this, how students from programs in the robotics and autonomous systems area, in the Bartlett area of connected environments, and the life sciences through nature smart cities, there's a plan for them to interact over how we understand, how we sense, how we gain data from, and how we interact with the natural environment around us. So it's bringing those that are involved in the design and development of infrastructure with technology and those in understanding the life sciences and ecology together as part of degree programs to interact on understanding how it's not just technology that goes out there into the field for interactions. So I think the aspects of a number of the degree programs really speak to how we create a curriculum that connects a number of things together. We also have a few areas that we see that cut across those. They're not explicitly one of the six, but they come out of, if you're doing these six things, there are things we're going to have to think about that connect them together as we think underneath. I think, for me, certainly the big one is thinking about the inclusivity of our programme. We're developing new programmes in the east of London. We're thinking about how we can provide access to those programmes for a broader range of students, and how both we can attract talent that plays to our tagline of London's Global University, but also makes us think about the environment we're in and how we can support the communities that are around us and that make up our local interaction. So I think very exciting discussions of foundation programs, year zero programs, of course art, making, engineering, that will allow students who have different backgrounds or are looking to change direction to enter into some of our programs and prepare them to ensure that they are successful when they enter those programs. Sustainability is something that has been a tagline for the Olympic Park since it very began. London, one of the first highlights, taglines that it gave out after winning the Olympics was this would be the most sustainable games ever. I think they did a fantastic job of living up to that, and I think that's part of the legacy that we need to live up to, both in what we do on the park, but also how our programs are preparing our students to understand what that means. Now, coming from engineering, sustainability is a word we bandy around a lot and means some quite specific things in many of our disciplines. Whereas the broader community, and we have discussions, I have a science, technology, engineering, public policy department in my faculty and a management science. Many of our programs, it's less obvious what sustainability actually means in their terms. If you're building chemical plants perhaps, or building new bridges, it's fairly obvious. But I think it is beholden on us to think about how we add a flavour of sustainability in all that we do across all of our degree programs, preparing our students for a world where any interactivity they have needs to have a flavour of sustainability to it. Which really builds to the final point of also building an entrepreneurial mindset. Now, I have to be a little bit careful here, because this doesn't necessarily mean entrepreneurialism. It doesn't necessarily mean we want all our students to go out and form their own companies. Nothing wrong with that, but that's not the first drive. It's really about thinking how we're developing the future leaders, how we're developing the students that are going to be maybe not necessarily the captains of industry as would have been said 20 years ago, but are going to be the thought leaders in their area. They are going to be the go-to people for the new ideas, which I think if we can tie a number of these aspects together, we have a good chance of being able to do. So I hope that gives a flavour of how we're thinking about the programs, some of the programs that are being developed, and some of the opportunities we have to make the most of what is really a historic opportunity on the park, from being able to think about so many things at one time. An opportunity I certainly have never seen in my 20 years at UCL in such a development and at such a scale. And something that hopefully we can really latch onto and do something quite novel, exciting and innovating. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, John. Is there any question from the audience?
Good.
I guess a question from me then. We have been developing the academic vision, as you have presented, with a lot of passion and enthusiasm, because we do believe that the philosophy of bringing together experiments, arts, society and technology can be done in a place like UCL and really giving life or a new life to the interdisciplinarity that we have got in this university. This brings challenges, I expect. We all hope that the new campus will be successful and there will be loads of students really taking advantage of the new programs that they will be have available. You've done the integrated engineering program in the faculty. How easily have the students adjusted to a new way of being taught, or to a new way of having to think all of a sudden, in that case, about the engineering discipline that they had undertaken to study?
Yes, thank you. That's a very, very good question. It's a very interesting question, actually. Certainly when I started a change program, one of the first things I was told by many people, you've got to remember that academic staff are conservative, they don't like change. Which There's some truth to that, probably not as much truth as I was led to believe. The bit I was told about less but came to discover is actually students can be very conservative as well. They know they've gone through a system that has taught them a certain way, and they've experienced. I think they know that university is going to be different. All the research shows that they're expecting something slightly different. But it can be quite an uncomfortable shift, particularly for students who have, really gone through, been high flyers in a system, playing one game to change the rules of the game considerably. But it can be done. It needs good communication. It needs good support. I think one thing we really learnt from changing to more experiential learning is you do have to think very carefully about how you support the students, how you ensure that your environment is inclusive in terms of the types of activities you get students involved in and how you support them in that. I think where a lot of these sort of things go wrong is where you don't think enough about what that support is going to be. Just putting a student in an environment and assuming that they will be able to deal with it is without the appropriate support, preparation, consideration to a number of factors is often where things come unstuck. Within the IEP, we put quite a lot of work up front for that because I think we'd appreciated that from some of the pilot work, and we have continued to build more and more in as we've gone along, as we found actually the support of supporting students in that transition to a way of working that many have not necessarily had a great deal of experience of, is absolutely critical. And so again, I think this plays into some of the student support services that we've discussed. Actually, I think there are things that we're still going to have to think as we see the nature of the programs develop, of what that suite of support is for students. Predominantly, to help ensure the transition and that they get the absolute best out of the experiences that you're giving them.
Any question that maybe this might have triggered?
It's interesting to hear what you said about the transition from, I suppose, school into a more integrated program. Has there been any work about the outcomes? So when students then go on into work, are they any evaluation of whether they're better prepared for work, or whether companies find them to be, I suppose, with the entrepreneurial mindset, more set up for a different style of working?
So I have to make an excuse at this point. We've only had one graduating year so far, so we're still in early days from that programme. And that is part of the plan. Again, it's your longitudinal studies of that sort of experience are quite difficult to do, but I think it's absolutely vital to show that there's been impact. I think it's one of the biggest flaws of much sort of educational research in whole-scale curriculum changes that very rarely is there good longitudinal data of what that actually means. I think, we've got plenty of anecdotal data about improved performance of final year students, particularly in terms of projects and the way they approach them. We've got great feedback from industry about, yes, this is what these are the sorts of students we're looking for, and we can see. Particularly, I find more and more industry don't really talk so much about knowledge so much. It's attitudes and attributes they talk about more of, students that interact in a certain way that can work across the business. These are the sorts of things they're looking for. And they see them played out in many of the activities that we do. So we've had at that level very positive response, but actually, any hard evidence following up, we're probably, just in the process of starting to collect that, because that's the phase we're in. And it's both challenging, but I think is going to have to be really, if we really want to show to others that this is a change worth putting the effort into making, we're going to have to collect quite rigorously.
Thank you. Any other thought or question? Anne.
Wait for the microphone. Otherwise it doesn't get recorded.
Okay, so obviously based on your experiences with the IEP, but also on what you've talked about here, from an academic perspective, does this entail more work? Does this take away from your, because obviously each academics are involved in research and teaching. Sure. So to what extent does having this new approach sort of encroach on is it like a new type of academic that is needed, or what? You know, how does this impact on your everyday academic in this new campus?
It certainly requires a different skill set. The difference between preparing 30 hours of PowerPoint and standing behind a lectern and delivering them to actually engaging with a class and in a very different environment is a different skill set. It can be uncomfortable. It's not, particularly things like facilitating group work. We did some research on this, and talking even to academics that had 10, 15 years experience of this, still trying to manage group dynamics and help groups when there were personality issues. They still find challenging, and I don't think you ever get entirely used to doing that sort of thing. So it does require a different skill set. It requires you to be more engaged. But certainly, personally, and the majority of staff I talk to, they find it a much more rewarding way of teaching. You can often see learning taking place in a way that a sea of 150 blank faces just doesn't quite give you. It also requires different types of preparation as well. I think you can, one of the reasons I think that the lecture has stuck so long is that actually it is nicely scalable. Once you go beyond about 40, 50 students, it doesn't matter whether it's 70, 150, 400. As far as the classroom goes, it scales very nicely. The printing bill just goes up slightly, and that's it. Although the one big thing that I prefer for this is many of these experiential activities, if you get the assessment right, which has to be different. I've seen people do it, but to run a really experiential, immersive activity and then give an exam at the end just feels a little bit wrong. I prefer most of the assessments we put in place over marking 180 exam scripts any day of the week. So I think all in all, it doesn't. I've seen little evidence that it creates huge extra workload, but it is a rather different workload, and it's spread rather differently over the year. And particularly if you've got large classes to facilitate, there are some issues in the scaling. We, in the IEP, use lots of PGTAs. We use lots of postgraduate students to assist in that, because you need numbers simultaneously, and that can be a bit of an issue. But
has it had any positive benefit on the research that your academics do? I think it has. I think a lot of our academics have now, they've really, particularly in some of the projects, that engagement with students has made them think about more about how they can engage those students in their projects. I think the flip side of it is the integrated idea of the programme, where we brought departments together. We've had evidence of academics interacting with each other in research because they met through some of these teaching groups we put together. Because I think as departments grow, there's 400 faculty in engineering now, something close to that. Actually the chances of meeting academics and become fairly rare. We're on 21 buildings, I think, with 400 staff. Now, actually, those interactions don't naturally happen, and bringing people in slightly, often not entirely obviously connected areas, slightly tangential, but those discussions. We've seen research build up out of those sorts of interactions. So I think this point of not, you teach one thing, you research another, that breeds this sort of connection. I often say we've been incredibly good at UCL, and our research powerhouse status comes about from the fact that actually we have fairly loose boundaries. I've never worried about whether someone's in another department or another faculty to work with them. I'm not, I don't think my head of department says, oh, it's not in our faculty, or it's not. We're very loose. We're very good at making these collaborations at research. We've been much worse at it at teaching, and that's partly because of the structures that are there. Now, I'm sure the heads of the university argue that they've put all the structures in place to allow us to work across our boundaries very easily. I've also heard that there's no structures in place and we do what we like and it works well because of it. And the truth probably sits somewhere slightly in the middle. But I think that's actually quite important to build, that we've not got these boundaries.
And I mean, to your point, there are tensions in that. You know, we still have departments, we still have faculties. We're not building new structures for UCL EAST. But there has been, right from the very beginning, a real spirit of collaboration. Now, occasionally it gets knocked out when you have to put that on a spreadsheet. That's always where things get a little bit more difficult. But it's always been there underlying. The people have been really excited about, oh, there's someone else. You know, Michael's got these wonderful studios and things. We can do all sorts of really cool things when we're in the same building as Michael. It's that sort of thing that I think, you know, the project has kept alive and is going to have to really work to build over the as we come up to opening, because that's where the really exciting stuff's going to happen, in these collaborations that we haven't quite seen just because staff are in the same place together or doing similar things.
Thank you, John. And perhaps we can close on a note to let you know that construction is about to begin. So Maze have now built the hoardings around the site, and there is a live camera, so we will be sharing the link so you can actually see on a daily basis now the lawn being removed and the digging progressing. So it is truly exciting. So thank you very much, John, and thank you very much for attending today's lecture.